Mute everybody, Alison, or should we just ask everybody to mute themselves?
I might have to do it manually, but I can keep an eye.
Okay, yeah, if everybody could just mute themselves, I think it's so. Thanks for coming, everybody, today to our members gathering. It's really nice to see so many people here. I think probably a few more will come in as we go along, and Alison will let them in. My name's Sarah Collett, and I'm the North Wales Development Worker for Social Farms and Gardens. How today's going to work, we're recording for a start, so just in case anybody didn't know that already, just so that you know. If you could all mute yourselves, I'll give a presentation, put questions in the chat that occur to you while I'm going through it. Alison will keep track of those. We'll have 10 minutes for questions relating to what I've just talked about. Then Paul's going to give a presentation, and it'll be open floor for more questions. And at that point, you can just put your hand up or use the little hand signal to say that you want to say something. We'll just have a general discussion about what you're doing on your projects to reduce your carbon footprints, which I'm sure is a lot. So I'm going to share my screen now, which hopefully, there we go. Aha, it's working. So a little bit of background to why we've chosen this topic for today's members gathering. Oh, no, it won't go on to the next one. Oh, there we go. It will. So in Wales, we're running a project called Camau Gwyrdd, Sustainable Steps, and it's a 3-year project to help people in Wales take their first steps towards positive climate action through community growing. So all the activities that are taking place, we're supporting existing projects to bring in new audiences to community growing and using community growing as a climate action. We were disconcerted in January of this year to read this study about the carbon footprint of urban agriculture, is what they call it in the study. The headlines of the so this first link is to the University of Michigan news site. Study finds that urban agriculture must be carefully planned to have climate benefits. That's fine. And then the article was published in Nature. The research was published in Nature. Again, a fairly reasonable headline comparing the carbon footprints of urban and conventional agriculture. And then they produced a policy brief, policies to promote low carbon urban agriculture. All good. But the headlines that you might have seen, that I saw in the UK press, were not so positive. Community gardens have 6 times the carbon footprint of agriculture, which is a bit concerning when you read it like that, isn't it? Are we doing more harm than good? Is community growing even a climate action? So I wanted to get hold of this paper and have a good read of it and find out what was actually going on, and then communicate that to you all and talk about what we can do to reduce the carbon footprint of our projects, although that's not what it's all about, as you'll find out. So they studied 73 urban agriculture sites, and it was a mixture of individual gardens, which I interpret as being sort of allotment plots, community gardens and urban farms. And out of these 73, 17 did actually perform as well as conventional agriculture in carbon footprint terms. And these were mainly urban farms and allotment plots. And if you think about it, it makes sense because urban farms, their focus is on production. They're producing a lot of food for the inputs that are going in. Whereas community gardens, it's not about, intensive production largely. It's more about the social and health benefits. So some did perform quite badly, carbon footprints wise. And so I looked at, the study looked at what the differences were. So this is an illustration from the study, and you can see, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but you can see the first one is 250 conventional agriculture sites that they compared the data from, and then 73 in total urban agriculture sites. 9 of those were community gardens, urban collective gardens. 7 were urban farms, and the vast majority were allotment plots, individual gardens. So then the headline figures overall were that per kilo of produce from community growing, 3.42 kilos of CO2, and from conventional agriculture, 0.47 kilos of CO2. So that's where you get this headline figure of 6 times the carbon footprint. But then, put it in context. You can really grow your vegetables however you like. They're still going to have a vastly reduced impact on the climate than meat and dairy. So if you look at all these different foods, you can see that veg is all down here at the bottom. And even if you were, it was 3.5 kilos per kilogram of vegetables, it's still way down here with tofu. And you could still have 30 times as much veg compared to meat for the same sort of carbon footprint. So if you're encouraging people to eat vegetables, you're still doing something very good. So the poor performers is because even though it's not, enormous amounts of carbon we're talking about, we all want to do well as we can in terms of carbon footprint. I know that. So the poor performers in terms of climate impact. So they talk about life cycle analysis. So if you've got a lot of new materials and they're used for a relatively short period of time, that has a high carbon footprint. So some projects are short-term in nature, and often that's to do with insecurity of tenure, which we do a lot of work on in getting long-term agreements for sites. Low productivity, but that might be because your project is largely about the social and health benefits. Poor composting or high inputs of brought in compost was another issue for these projects that were poor performers in terms of climate impact. Good performers in terms of climate impact. So long-term projects where that life cycle analysis, the carbon embedded in your infrastructure is used over a long period of time. So then you break even and you start to, well, you'll see the graph in a minute. High productivity. So if you're producing a ton of vegetables for your infrastructure, it's gonna have a lower carbon impact per kilo than if you're just producing a small amount of fruit and veg. Recycled infrastructure or longevity of new materials was really important, and good composting and low inputs also very important. So here you can see another illustration from the study. So infrastructure is red, supplies are blue, and irrigation is this sort of beige colour. And it's the contribution to carbon footprint in percentages. So you can see that for these are community gardens on the left, and then these are the urban farms, and these are the urban individual gardens, or what we would call allotment plots, I think here. Yeah. So you can see that infrastructure has a massive impact on some of them. It's absolutely huge. It's almost 100% of your carbon footprint. Some of them much less so. Some of this irrigation, I mean, it does take energy to make water for drinking. And if we're using that water to water our vegetables, that also has an impact. So, water harvesting, really important, but less so in, it has irrigation had less of an impact in wet countries. So if it rains a lot on your community garden, then you don't need to worry about watering too much, do you? Only in a drought. So this illustrates very clearly the effect of the life cycle analysis. So as you can see on the left, an urban collective garden or community garden, they never broke even. This is over 100 years. So here's the median break even, this dotted line. And you can see that urban agriculture sites, the lifespan of an urban agriculture site in years. So the middle one is an urban farm, they did really well. So because they're so productive, there's a lot of productivity for their infrastructure. So that's why you see this difference. So, try and use recycled materials for your infrastructure is the big message. Yeah. Why we shouldn't panic. So when the study's authors adjusted for social outputs, all the projects compared favourably with conventional agriculture. So if 90% of your outputs are health, well-being, community resilience, you don't need to obsess over the carbon impact of the relatively small amount of veg that you are growing. Also, when they adjusted for good composting and recycled infrastructure, good composting reduced the carbon footprint by 39.4% and recycled infrastructure by 52%. They add up to about 90%. So if you can get on top of those things, you'll be having a big impact on your project. So we can reduce the carbon impact of our projects enormously by making those changes, recycled infrastructure, or, if you really do need something new, make sure that it's got a really long lifetime. Composting, good composting, not just any composting, and water harvesting. But still, veg grown any way you like still has a tiny carbon footprint compared to meat and dairy. So if you're encouraging a veg-rich diet, you're still making a difference. So this was a nice document that they produced. This is the recommendations for policy and practice. So in the three countries that they studied were the US, Germany, and the UK. So it's got a US sort of tone, the study. But so here this would be like for advice for local authorities and maybe community and town councils. So one that I thought was really interesting and that we don't do very well on is allowing access to safe building waste for garden construction. So there's so much waste in our society, and from demolition and from building sites, if that waste stream could be made available, then that would be really helpful for everybody. So yeah, promote low carbon nutrient sources by composting, promote the social benefits at farms and gardens, and secure land tenure for urban agriculture sites, which clearly we're lobbying for as well and can support you with through the Community Land Advisory Service. And identify high carbon food imports and replace them with local production. So a lot of veg, even in season, you'll see green beans flown from Kenya, or sugar snap peas, asparagus, things like that, or fruits, sort of fragile fruits like raspberries. There's very high impact of all the packaging and the transport. So maybe choose to grow those sort of crops. And we can have a look at some carbon swaps we could make. Raised beds made with new wood we see everywhere. Reuse wood from construction or demolition, scaffold planks, use bricks, old bricks. I couldn't think of the word for this, but the sawmill, when they planked the tree, there's the sort of rounded bits left over on the edges. I can't remember what that's called. But certainly our local sawmill has a lot of that left over, and it just gets chopped up for firewood or it gets chipped. So that's a kind of waste product you can use. You make grave beds, and you use raised beds where really needed. And not all your vegetables need to be surrounded by a wooden box. And if you do need raised beds, which clearly you do sometimes, and you don't have any recyclable or reused options available, then use something with a really long life, get good quality materials that are going to last a long time. Path surfacing, maybe you do need accessible paths for wheelchair users and pushchairs. You can use recycled subbase for that, which is crushed concrete and brick from demolition. That is widely available. And for paths between beds, you can just use wood chip from tree surgeons. And I'm sure people have got lots of other good ideas for these things. Other infrastructure, the local free ads around here are absolutely full of old sheds, greenhouses, and tools. Make the effort to get those things secondhand rather than buying new. It really does make a big difference. For water collection, locally to us, and I'm sure locally to you, there's a company that recycles IBCs and other plastic containers from food and drink transport. So they've had orange juice in them, something like that. And you can get those and they will be reused. Make your compost heap from pallets. We have a library of things in Wales called Benthyg. Maybe there's a similar thing where you are. So you can borrow large tools or you can share with other plot holders. And we're also working in Carmarthenshire at the moment on a machinery ring. So urban farms, city farms, big community gardens can set up machinery rings and share large machinery. Compost. Didn't I start on compost already? Anyway, compost is one of the largest sources of carbon emissions in the study. I did email one of the study authors because I wasn't sure about their methodology. And what they'd done is they'd used another study that gave the methane and nitrous oxide emissions for different types of composting, terrible slimy compost heap with no browns, right to like the best you could possibly do. And they did like an average figure. So yeah, methane, if you compost badly, anaerobic composting releases methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. And if you've got excess nitrogen in your compost, it can release nitrous oxide, which is an even more potent greenhouse gas over 100 years. So the key, as I'm sure you all know, is the greens and browns balance. So traditionally, it's 70-30, isn't it? But actually, you can up your browns to over 15-1 if you want to really reduce emissions. Obviously, that means bringing in some browns from outside usually. but there's an awful lot of wastage in our society, and you can bring in a lot of shredded cardboard and other browns. You can keep leaves that you've collected, big sacks of leaves over the winter, and you can use those to layer your compost heap. So buy as little commercial compost as possible. Learn and teach effective composting, avoiding aerobic compost heaps and following the rules of greens and browns. Use recycled materials to build your bays. Also, they did find, I felt like I should check this because it seemed like such a high figure. In the study, it says that community grown projects apply 12 kilos per metre square of compost. So maybe think about, green manures, cover crops, and this fantastic video about chop and drop I like very much. Hugh Richards, you can check that out on YouTube. So if you're just when you're weeding or you're taking out plants that have kind of finished producing, chop them up and sprinkle them on the surface of your soil, act as a mulch. And because it's only a thin layer, the soil bacteria can incorporate and break it down, and you won't get those emissions. Compost continued. So currently we don't really value or use nutrients effectively in animal agriculture and in non-animal agriculture. We're not dealing with those nutrients effectively. Instead, they're polluting our rivers. There's runoff, these awful kind of lagoons of manure, and then spread too thick on the land. Bacteria can't cope with it. There's nitrous oxide emissions from that. So by all means, take manure that's available locally, compost it, but treat it as a green. So if you can get manure that's got straw in it, obviously that's better. But yeah, it's got very high nitrogen. And of course, you can use the local authority green waste compost, which has been professionally processed. But we all know it's not always brilliant. So as a soil improver or a mulch. Water harvesting, I'm sure you all do this. Most of the projects that they studied did, but they didn't collect most of the water they used, if you see what I mean. So you could try and do it more effectively. You can connect IBCs and use ball cocks so that when the first one's full, it fills the next one, but they never overflow, if you see what I mean. You can use, on our local allotment site, we've put in water troughs, animal troughs, to encourage the use of watering cans over hoses to reduce the usage of mains water, because you can just dip 2 watering cans in. There's no waiting to fill your can, so people are more likely to use watering cans than they would if it took ages to fill it from a tap. Mulch, 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 because bare soil loses moisture. Yeah, so I mentioned this earlier. Choose your crops carefully, choose high carbon crops and grow them, and then that they compare favourably. So it's not all about carbon. Community grown sites are biodiversity havens, so make sure you're incorporating habitats, ponds and margins, and look after your soil life. And community resilience and empowerment are essential in adapting to the climate crisis. Behaviour change, so that extends to whole lifestyle. So if you've got somebody coming to your plot, and even if you're not producing very much veg at all, if they're introducing more veg to their diet, they're eating seasonally, that behaviour change has a knock-on effect on their lifestyle and on their friends and families, and also makes good quality fresh food available and affordable, which is really important. There's no packaging waste or transport particulates associated with community grown food, and 30% of food commercially produced is wasted. So I imagine the figures are less community grown food, because when you put that much effort into something, you're likely to actually eat it. And then, of course, the mental and physical health benefits, which are well documented. So maybe it'd be worth having a study to compare the carbon footprint of different health interventions and hobbies, because I'm absolutely sure that community growing would compare favourably. And as they mentioned in the study, once you adjust for social benefit, 90% of a lot of community gardens in particular, the output is actually not necessarily just about the fruit and veg, as we all know. I think that's it. Yes, that is the end. So I'll stop sharing my screen. And Alison, if you could let me know about any questions in the chat.
Thank you, Sarah. That was brilliant. We haven't actually got any specific ones in the chat at the moment. I think you covered a lot of areas there. So if anyone has got one and wants to pop it in the chat, or if you wanted to unmute, we have got another presentation. So we'll just take a couple of questions now if anyone wanted to raise anything on the study.
Feel free to just put your hand up and ask. It'd be nice to hear somebody else's voice than ours in between. Give everybody a break from us presenting. Anybody has got a question? Oh, Tracy, brilliant. Are you unmuted?
Can you hear
There we
me
go.
okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've tried to do all the things that you've said pretty much, so that's really good. But we realised that potting compost is where we fall down. And recently we keep thinking we've found the perfect brand of potting compost, and they've been rubbish because they've been set outside in all that rain. So we wonder if anyone's done much work on making your own potting compost. We use wood chip on quite a lot of our paths, and it composts down beautifully over a couple of years. So we have tried with that and some additions, but obviously weed seeds more likely to come in, and you're not always sure what you're growing, which can be quite exciting. But any thoughts that you have on better ways?
Anybody made their own good potting compost mix from Homemade Compost and Impress? Well, Jim?
Yeah, well, we have worm compost, vermicompost, the whole project, and we'd love to share it with other people. We make about 1,500 bags a year and can't keep up with the demand. But if anybody's got any horses and don't know what to do with the poo, then we'd love to share that all over the shop. So please,
so you vermicompost horse poo?
We vermicompost horse poo, and it's beautiful stuff for potting, mixing it with coir. But hopefully, with Paul's help, we'll be getting rid of the coir before long and getting onto something else. But I'll put my email address in the thing. If anybody wants more information, please get in touch.
That is a fantastic top tip, because that's where I fall down as well.
We're hoping to have a chat soon, aren't we, Jim? We could have a chat about that online.
What would you replace coir with, Paul?
Oh, well, I think the thing that everyone in Wales should be growing is reed mace. I am convinced that reed mace is the crop for the future, or one of the crops for the future in Cymru. Yeah, I worked on a market garden in Scotland many years ago, where all of the potting compost was made on site. But they did have this amazing bit of old Victorian kit, which was a kiln for sterilizing the topsoil element without sterilize. So we used an old Victorian recipe, so with sand, and I think there was some worm compost in it, and there was some seaweed meal in it, and there was some topsoil in it, but the topsoil had to be sterilized, otherwise you get weed seeds. But it was very good. I mean, you can get these old Victorian recipes and have a go at making your own compost mixes. In the 70s, there were experiments with using cardboard. And in fact, Thysson's funded a lot of these experiments and discovered that cardboard-based compost was as good as peat, which was then, unsurprisingly hushed up. And everyone forgot it had ever been done. But cardboard is a really good substrate for compost making.
Has anyone and Paul, have you thought about sheep's wool as the kind of substrate to mix with, with compost as well, or alpaca wool and stuff? Because we have quite a bit of spare sheep's fleeces in Wales.
Yeah, it would be a brilliant idea to experiment with that. I've seen people use it for on a broad scale for mulch.
Yeah.
Isn't Hugh, who's a fan of Hugh Richards, hasn't he done some experiments in his garden with wool, I think? Yeah, but I don't know about the composting, Katie.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen it done for mulching very, very much, but I'm not sure about composting.
I've seen Dalesford make a compost that is a combination of sheep's wool and bracken. So
now bracken
we could be world leaders in that in Wales.
Bracken is really interesting. Bracken is really interesting because although it makes an ericaceous compost on its own, if you take a portion of it aside and dry it and then burn it and add it back, you neutralize the pH. So yeah, anywhere bracken is coming down the hillside at you, it's really a cascade of potential fertility, potential compost.
Brilliant.
You could do a whole webinar on that, using weeds and things that people find that they are a nuisance, that they're actually a resource. But I was just going to say, Sarah, that this is so useful because when you see these headlines, it's incredibly worrying that it gives a bad name to all the small hyper local projects that are working so hard and have multi benefits, you know, and we do need the ammunition to counter it. Yeah,
Exactly.
and
Yeah,
you've done
we
the
really
research
do.
here, so
Yeah.
please send us all the slides and we can.
Yes, we will send you the slides, but also everybody that's registered online, I haven't quite finished putting it into a sort of, you know, a resource that you can share more easily and use. But we will have a bilingual resource available on this soon, which we'll send to you all.
Thank you.
John?
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say the whole subject's a can of worms, but that's perhaps a bit try. I mean, yeah, the answer is there's no ideal solution. You just got to use whatever you've got to hand at the moment. And you know, I thought when the guy was saying what we've got in Wales, and he went on to say reed mace or something. I mean, I thought he was going to say bracken and sheep, as you said, bracken and sheep's wool, because I think it's a Lake District company, isn't it, that produce that.
It is. Yeah.
They've got quite a lot of bracken in the Lake District, and you know, where I live, we haven't got very much bracken. So, but yeah, the answer is there's no ideal solution. It's just local. It's doing whatever you've got locally, and again, you know, commercially, trying to get an organic. I mean, commercial growers really struggle to get an organic peat-free consistent growing media. And yeah, the latest one that sort of my commercial grower friends recommended, you know, comes from Germany, and now it's got to be imported into Southern Ireland because of Brexit. So yeah, commercial growers struggle. So the answer is we use whatever's local and don't beat yourself up if you get a few weed seeds in it. So yeah,
Definitely. I totally agree. Who we got? Tracy? Is your hand still up, or did you have another question?
It is another question. Well, it's a question of you particularly, Sarah. We wrote a sort of popular eco guide, which is actually on the Social Farms and Gardens resources, and I wondered if you'd seen it. If you're going to produce a thing, I don't know how bad you think it is compared to all your scientific stuff. But
oh no, this was not my study. This was just me reading the study.
Yeah,
and drawing
but anyway,
some conclusions.
It might be that some of it's worth stealing if you're going to be doing something.
What is it? Can you send me a link?
It's called Climate Change Gardeners Pack, and it's in the resources section on the Social Farms and Gardens website.
Brilliant.
It's
That's
aimed as
so
a popular kind of thing rather than scary. Lots of photos and cartoons and things.
But the answers are very simple though, aren't they? So it doesn't need to be you know, like somebody, or it might be you that said we do, oh no, it was Patricia, that we do need the ammunition to say, you know, this is a scary headline, but actually it doesn't reflect the reality of what people are doing on the ground and all the benefits that are not about carbon. But so simple and accessible are definitely the way to go.
And I can't believe any community gardens are using new pots ever.
No, I'm sure they're not. Oh, yeah, right. Inputs. Yeah, who would buy a pot these days? There's so much waste out there, isn't there, that we can reuse and do good things with. Yeah. Vicky?
No, I just wondered about the infrastructure. Maybe I wasn't listening carefully to know what infrastructure, because I was racking my brains to think what infrastructure we use in our gardens, apart from the fencing.
Yeah, maybe you don't use very much, which is great.
Yeah, the IBCs is an issue, and we have got secondhand and new, so that could be, we lean away from the new, that would make sense. But every bit of sheds that I can think of, possibly except the sprues, is recycled material.
Which is great, but you
can't afford anything else.
Totally, and that's absolutely the way to go. I think probably some of the projects, you know, that one, you get funding for a new community garden, for example, you get capital funding and you buy a lot of sleepers, come on the back of a lorry. You might buy a lovely, great big communal shed, polytunnel, greenhouses, new water butts, brand new tools, new wheelbarrows, basically anything you spend money on that's new, that's what the infrastructure is. And at some places, you know, concrete paths in. Some places have to put security fencing in, you know, new allotment sites that are in areas where everything would just get vandalized. Those are the sort of things that we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. Just on the vandalizing, we have sites and places which should get vandalized, and mysteriously it hasn't happened. I'm not saying it never will, but everyone's really security fencing, but nobody could afford it. And for some reason it hasn't happened. Don't ask me why.
That's really great to hear. That's really nice. Yeah. So unless anybody else has got another question, we should move on to Paul's
Jules.
bit, I think. Oh, Jules.
Hi, yeah, so I can't find that little yellow hand.
Aha. And I can't see everybody, so
Okay. But yeah, following on what John said about going back to the potting compost or seed compost, as an example, what we do locally, because I'm in the southeast Canterbury, Whitstable way. We've got loads of strawberry farming, you know, probably very high carbon around us, and they use coir as part of their medium for growing the strawberries, and then we get it second hand, so it's recycled coir that we can buy in ton bags, so not lots of extra plastic, for 65 quid for a ton bag. So we use that for our seed compost, and then we mix in our own homemade compost to make it a bit more richer for the potting compost. So I thought I'd add that in.
yeah, no, that's great. And yeah, anything that's sort of been discarded essentially that you can get hold of.
Yeah.
So people use mushroom compost as well, don't they? Really, anything like that you can get hold of has got to be a good thing,
Yeah.
hasn't it?
And
Yeah,
I
that
think
sounds really
there's
good.
that farm Tolhurst Organics. I don't know.
Yeah.
He makes a lot of his own potting seed compost, doesn't he? Using wood chip.
does he?
I think it's like an 18-month process, but I think that'd be quite interesting to look into how he does that.
Yeah, maybe we should produce something about specifically potting compost,
Yeah.
you know. But the trouble is, isn't it, is that it is a long process and it comes to spring and you think,
Yeah.
I
At
need
times.
it now. And if you haven't done it in advance, then, you know, it's time, isn't it? Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Thank you. So, any more? Shall we move on to Paul's presentation? Yeah. Paul?
Okay. Yeah, I was quite enjoying that discussion. If you'd like to carry on, that'll be fine. I don't mind. Right. So I'll share what I've got. Okay. Everyone's been measuring our impact. So I did a very clever thing. I had all my notes printed out, and I realized when Sarah started that I don't think these are the notes that I want printed out. I was frantically making notes in pen. So really, this part of this project that Sarah and I have been working on is producing a tool that projects can use to measure their impact as an alternative to ecological footprinting. Any of you who've had to do your own ecological footprint, we have to do our own ecological footprint here as part of our planning conditions on a regular basis, or the kind of carbon converters that farms use. So as an alternative intended for small and medium-sized community or environmental projects, that's to say community gardens. There's a too long did not read at the end of this, but I think essentially if our projects do everything that Sarah mentioned and everything that came up in the discussion, you know, that's as good as it gets. That's the gold standard. You don't need this tool really, but the tool is meant for planning our actions, our activities, and for use in meetings as an intuitive learning tool about what we do and how we do it, a way of prompting discussion and planning along the lines of reducing, measuring, and reducing our impact. So it may seem at times like it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but you know, this approach may be useful. So, cutting to the heart of the matter, we live in an oil-based economy, and any money that you spend in the end is money being spent on oil, and on carbon emissions. And it's certainly true that some money being spent will be less carbon intensive than others, but we're looking for a straightforward, intuitive tool. So we're going to work on the assumption that for every pound you spend, you're increasing your carbon emissions, you're increasing your footprint, if you like. People do talk a lot about decoupling. And interestingly enough, I was listening to a webinar with Jason Hinkle, who's an economist, a degrowth economist, and he said the 10 most carbon decoupled economies in the world are 200 years away from where they need to be in order to reach net zero and all of that contentious stuff. So no one is anywhere near decoupled. Every pound you spend is a pound on oil. I mean, and that's the clue to the rest of this presentation, essentially. And it links up with a lot of what Sarah was saying, of course. So the first part of this approach is to work out the boundaries of your project. So this comes straight from my background in permaculture design. Consider the extent of your project, both the physical extent, the physical boundaries, and the limits of your activities. So what does your project do? List its main activities. This is a way of working out what we should measure. This might be important for projects that comprise different elements. For example, a gardening project that's attached to a community centre or to a community kitchen. You might just want to measure one part of it rather than all of it. What are the central expenditures that we're going to track? Some things that your project purchases will stand out as important. We've talked about compost and pallets of compost being delivered and trucks full of Merlin's Magic being delivered. Some minor expenditures will just be considered minor. The level of detail you want in your tracking has to suit the time and energy available to the task. And that's the other main inspiration behind the way I'm looking at this tool. I've been lucky enough to visit a lot of most excellent projects in the last few months, and at none of them, I have to tell you, has anyone grabbed me and said, Paul, I desperately need to work out how to convert what we do into a measure of carbon emissions, or we need to find Bob a job to do, and Bob doesn't like gardening, so he'd prefer to sit at a computer for several hours working out what our exact carbon emissions are. You have to have a tool that works. People who would rather be growing flowers or vegetables or out in the garden. So what are the central expenditures? There are a few here: tools, seeds, compost, polytunnels. And then once we work out what we're recording, we just record those things religiously through the gardening year. And it can be high tech. I know some people like spreadsheets more than I do. Or cash flow software, or it can be low tech. It could be a cash book and a pencil, as long as everyone's recording things. I think it is important not to forget mileage. One of the aspects of community gardens, particularly in Cymru, is that many of them are out of settlements. And one of the big expenditures is traveling to and from community gardens or to and from projects, even if those in themselves, those projects are excellent environmentally. And also that prompts thinking about a possible solution, right, where people don't all turn up in their own cars, where they work out ways to reduce this aspect of their expenditure. If some of the major expenditures, are on items which last more than 1 year, then you can divide the specific cost by the expected lifetime of the items. So if you have hand tools and you think, well, at the least these hand tools will last 5 years, then you divide their cost by 5. A polytunnel plastic is always reckoned to be renewed every 5 years. So you divide that by 5. The frame itself, of course, can last very much longer. If you buy a good shed, it might be by 10 years. If you buy a rubbish shed, it might be by 3 years, particularly if you're on a windy site. So this kind of it's got to be, to a certain extent, estimation to start with, but based on observation of your site and an understanding that oftentimes you get what you pay for. So the next element of this tool is once you have an expenditure figure for year one and the end of year one, you can divide that by the number of regular participants. This makes sense if if there's a project involving 3 of you and you're spending as much as the next project in the next village, which has 30 participants, then your impact is heavier per head. This is a way of accurately reflecting your project's impact, environmental impact, carbon impact. So ideally prior to your end of year one meeting, if you've been using Excel, there's a button. You just press a button and it will produce a pie chart for you or a bar chart showing you what the different slices of your expenditure pie are. And if you don't use Excel and you've just used a cash book, then a bar chart is easily produced by hand, ideally on a big sheet of paper with felt tips, something nice and colourful. My ideal is that these charts will be printed out and made available to everyone that comes to your annual general meeting or the discussion of how you're going to plan the next growing year. So I think most projects, certainly most projects and businesses I've been involved in, have surprises, in store when people have a good look at where the money's gone, what it's gone on. And I think that's where this tool comes into its own. People will say, wow, well, yeah, we didn't spend that much on seeds. Turns out the seeds have cost several £100s, and everyone's going to be quite surprised. The same is true of compost or tools, little bits that are added to the annual expenditure, incrementally. In any event, I think it's a very, very valuable tool, something to bring to a meeting based on expenditure like that. So this occurred to me because many years ago I did A-level economics, and the maths looks absolutely terrifying. But what you can do, quite simply, and there's bound to be someone involved in most projects who enjoys this kind of challenge, is convert your expenditure into an index number where year one is 100. And then where year one divided by the number of your participants is 100. And then you can work out quite easily where your project's expenditure is going. So if your project's expenditure goes up by 10% from year one to year two, your new index number will be 110. It's not as difficult as it looks. It might not appeal to everyone, but it's easily charted then. I think Sarah, my partner, said, "Oh, what about inflation?" You could take inflation into account as well, if you wanted. So when we've got all this, hold an annual general meeting, project might have one of these anyway, but after year one, you will now have expenditure per participant figure, a nice chart, and an index number. Using the chart, you can discuss where you might economize in the coming year and how. This expenditure tracking tool will help keep everyone, no matter their learning style, no matter their their awareness of matters financial, aware of how big a slice of the cake the various costs of running the garden eat up. So nearly there. The too long did not read. I managed to slip a slide of a sleeping cat into this presentation, along with anyone who noticed Kermit the Frog in the earlier slide. That was my other treat to myself. When you spend money, at some remove, you're buying fossil fuels and you're emitting carbon. So track what your project spends on all the important stuff. At least year on year, aim to spend less per person involved in your project. This means building projects which meet their own needs ecologically and through good design. And that's degrowth, which you may be familiar with or you may not, but that seems to be where this is heading as far as my thinking is concerned. So yeah, good design. where we see the garden as part of the local ecosystem, picking up, this goes back to what Sarah was saying, I'm not saying anything new here, it's just a reiteration, where we go back to picking up on the resource or waste flows of our settlements, and good design where we're encouraged to do things like think about our transport to our projects, where we're encouraged to think long term, for example, about properly designing and creating microclimates, because in the long run it's cheaper than and more likely to be durable in the medium to long term than using polytunnels or greenhouses. So, you know, permanent windbreaks. What we think about when we put community gardens in is, well, let's get a polytunnel on site. Whereas several steps earlier than that, we should have been thinking, where's the permanent windbreak? Okay. And we should think about things like the change of the culture of our growing in regard to this as well, to slowly reduce the amount of money we're spending per participant. So we should be thinking about not just no dig to reduce cultivation and build soil, but also the use of perennials, the use of self-seeders. Okay, we should be thinking about forest gardens. We should be thinking about cultural change, what we eat and what we grow to eat. And related to that, growing what we can grow where we are on a lower energetic basis. Okay, so if it turns out it's super energy intensive every single year to grow carrots, like it is here in the west of Cymru, then arguably we should be growing skirret, right? If brassicas are really energy intensive, then go over to growing perennial kale, Benton's kale, right, for example. And I think the final point I want to make is that all of this to me suggests working on our traditional skills. So one of the traditional skills of the craft of gardening is composting. Of course, we're all aware of that. But I think also related to this is season extension through preservation. You'll be aware of that as well. And tool maintenance. So going back to what I said a few slides ago about the lifespan of the things we buy, if one of the things we do with volunteer induction is talk about tool maintenance and make sure everyone knows what oil to use on wooden handled tools and how to sharpen tools and how to use tools properly, then those tools last longer, which has a climate impact. And I think all that we're really talking about is going to stuff which clearly was common sense in an old-fashioned gardening landscape with an old-fashioned gardening aesthetic, where people made do and made things last and developed skills that allowed them to do that in a time when they couldn't just go out and spend more money, which equals more carbon emissions. I shall unshare my screen now, if I can. Escape. Stop
Great,
share.
thanks, Paul. Thank you. We've got 10 minutes for questions. We like to finish bang on time because that's what we've advertised, 4 till 5. So are there any questions in the chat? Maybe we should be going for wallipinis instead of polytunnels. Yeah. You want to explain what a wallipini is, Tracy? Because not everyone will know.
Well,
Or maybe
if I
Tracy's gone.
understand
Oh, you know, you're there.
correctly, it's where you've got an earth-sheltered structure with a roof that's angled so that you get the most solar gain in the year. And you usually will have it double paneled so that you're getting an air gap to keep as a, like an insulation effect. And you usually then have something that will accumulate heat on the wall that sun also falls in, like dark colored barrels of water or something else like that.
Ah, yeah.
And it helps obviously if you're on a slope that faces the right way, but you can dig down and throw up what you've dug to make your back wall. So I would love to have one, but our site unfortunately doesn't lend itself to doing that.
No. After your explanation, I want one as well.
Even
Vicky? you had a couple
Oh,
of questions. Sorry,
Yeah,
Paul.
I'll just be brief. I was at a meeting recently and I rubbished the speaker and I got roundly told off. But I'm sure Paul is we're all much more safe with each other than that, because I do actually totally disagree. I think it's nonsense to say that money and carbon emissions are equivalent. Some things are made using fossil fuels and some things are not. And as you know, just apply common sense and you'll see that. Similarly, we've been living without emitting fossil fuels in any problematic manner for thousands of years and trading. So it's kind of misleading because we need to avoid using things which are made with fossil fuels. And if you say any spending is the problem, then that will mislead people. And that's a dangerous and counterproductive thing to do. But great to be self-sufficient and, for other reasons, that's always a nice direction to go in. Services that people provide, yes, they eat. So, I won't elaborate, but I just please apply common sense and don't swallow that whole. Thank you, Paul, for not advising me.
I think it's probably a bit of a simplification for ease of use. Much of what we buy now is. Do you want to answer that, Paul? Or?
Yeah, I'd like to.
Was that a bad thing to say?
I'd like to answer that without roundly. What happened to you in the other meeting, Vicky? No, I like.
Oh, it's awful.
Quite briefly, in case there are other questions.
Yeah, very briefly. Okay, so yeah, I like to believe that I have some common sense. That's the first thing, and I don't think that a disagreement requires anyone to impugn my common sense. So, but I come to this with some knowledge and with some understanding and talking to climate scientists. In fact, for this presentation, I talked to Cambridge mathematician, very high-powered lady, who, in a qualified way, verified my approach. So I think the thing isn't to say everything you spend money on has the same amount of embodied carbon, but at some remove down the chain, carbon is involved. Okay, that's all. So it will be an interesting discussion to have, Vicky, but please, common sense is a thing that in 55 years I have developed a little bit of. So I did do some research for this presentation.
Perhaps when we send out the resources, we can put something in, a good link to something that explains your thinking behind the link between carbon and spending and why that works as a tool.
Decoupling just really hasn't progressed very far. As I say, you take the 10 most decoupled economies in the world, they are 200 years away from where we need to be for net zero. So if someone shows you a chart about decoupling economic growth from carbon, we are very, very, very early stage. Theoretically it could be done. Personally, I'm skeptical, but theoretically
let's expand this another time.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thanks, Vicky. Has anybody else got any other questions? No. Okay. Any feedback? Anything at all? So we will send you the resource that we produce and the slides, if you'd like them, a link to the slides, and the whole session has been recorded. So we'll send a link to that as well, so that you can pass it on to other people, or I can't imagine you want to watch it again, but you might. So I'd like to say thank you to everybody for coming today. I think we're finishing